So, good morning, everybody. I hope you had a very good nonviolent break. No untoward episodes in it. I know some of you went to exotic places, and I'd like to hear about that from you when we get a chance. I hope you all got my CourseWeb announcement that I will have a truncated office hour today, because at 12:30 I'm going to be having a radio interview with Kathy Kelly, who is somebody that I hope you will learn to know and love, as I do. She and I are being interviewed on a program called Values of the Wise, in case you wanted to get it on the web. I don't know how they got me on that program, but that was their choice. And I'll try and make up for that with some other hours as soon as we get a chance and settle down from the holiday. Your papers, your proposals for the term paper are here. I hope you enjoy the alphabetization. It's a superb alphabetization job by Amy. I'm just going to hand them around now because I don't think we have time for me to hand them back individually, much as I'd still like to get to know some of you better. Some of your proposals, I would say the proposals vary from good to awesome. Some of them are really fantastic. It could actually lead to successful nonviolent revolutions in various parts of the world. Elizabeth, we have seats up here if you care. Now, some of you have not gotten your midterm papers back yet, and that's not a good move, because you want to look at those and see what you didn't know and use them as a learning tool. Okay. Just in terms of the world, instead of PAX 164b for a second, not that those two are so different, but tomorrow ends what's called the Season of Nonviolence, which is a 64-day period that stretches from the memorial of the assassination of Gandhi on January 30th to the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is tomorrow, April 4th. I was talking about this yesterday. I've tried to send it time, as you can tell. I was talking about this yesterday at San Francisco State, and they invited me to speak to sort of wrap up the season. And I said, I hope you won't feel that this is ungrateful for me to do this, but I think this is the wrong season, and it's typical of a bad move that is constantly made in the peace movement, and that is to memorialize death and violence and negativity instead of memorializing life and nonviolence and the real. And they took it pretty well, but it's an example of how, when you're struggling to create a new way of looking at things, a new paradigm, I'm going to get back to that term in a second. When you're struggling to create a new paradigm, which we've been doing consciously since 1970, we being a very small group of people, what you sometimes find is that when you reach out to do the opposite of the system that you disagree with, you often end up unconsciously taking over some of their symbols, and with it some of their meanings and some of their values. And this, I think, is a good example of that. We should completely turn our back on the idea of celebrating death and just do our own thing. Not in a sentimental way. I mean, you're not flower children or anything, but my main point is not to take over the symbols of the other side. Oscar, I hope we can talk for just a second after class. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say something about a paradigm shift. This is really an unfortunate thing that makes me very unhappy. The State Department, I guess it must probably be the Justice Department, has recently said that we have to get ready for a paradigm shift in America in terms of security, where we now are going to have to accept the fact that it's legal to spy on American citizens. So, and they're calling that a paradigm shift. So you see, here's our great word, which we're going to use to break out of all of this. And what did they do? They came along and they co-opted it, as though more fascism was a paradigm shift when you've already got too much fascism. So it's pretty galling, pretty upsetting. And in fact, this is not the first time this has happened. I happen to have studied a little bit early fascist movement in Europe. Well, that's too grand a way to put it. I stayed in an apartment in Paris where the guy was a professor who was an expert in this, and I read his books. I didn't study it, I read his books, and I picked up some very interesting things about fascism. And in some ways, it was a whacked-out movement. You have whole police departments exercising, doing their calisthenics in the nude, things like that you don't usually associate with fascism. You associate with certain beaches in California. But the other thing that I learned from that brief exposure was that they called their movement Die Neue Welle, the new wave. So they captured people's desire to break out and experience something new, and turned that into deepening the old. So I don't know what lesson I'm drawing from all of this, but it made me so mad I thought I'd have to share it with you guys. It's known as venting, and there's nothing you can do about it. So let's get back to our topics. Now, we're a little bit off from the syllabus, as you've noticed. I had to rearrange some things because of guest speakers. We knew that would happen. So Thursday we're having John Lindsay Poland from Fellowship of Reconciliation. When I first met him, he was working with Peace Brigades International. So he's got a long track record working in South America for nonviolent causes. And so I have already talked a little bit about the stuff that's on the syllabus for today, namely Chipko and the other anti-globalist movements, to call them that are taking place in India. So this was to carve out the opportunity now to talk about globalism itself and how does it figure in for us who are coming at the world from a nonviolent perspective. The other thing that you had on your readings, which I really haven't had a chance to discuss yet, are the people in Peace is the Way. I know you've all been keeping up diligently with the reading, so you read all of these essays. Wipe that smile off your face, Nicola. You read all of these essays. What I did was I chose people who were representative of different viewpoints and who I also thought were important opinion leaders in the creation of the nonviolent, what we used to call a paradigm. I don't know what we're going to call it now that they've stolen our word. But the people that I assigned from Peace is the Way, an FOR production, along with Kathy Kelly, I think are some of the people who are really trying to figure this thing out for us, both in action and in theory. By the way, Alex, I know I owe you an email. I forgot to get back to you. Okay, so good. From the nonviolent point of view, I'm going to make a big generalization here. You do some big picture stuff and look way back in history. You could describe global history as not what biologists call a punctuated equilibrium, but rather a punctuated evolution. In other words, in one sense, it's been an absolutely steady process where you started with people in very, very small communities isolated from one another, and they proceed to grow and expand. And then, of course, you have new modes of transportation, and now you have new modes of virtual transportation known as information technology, and people encounter each other much more closely than they did before. And what's going to happen at these stages where people suddenly become aware of one another? Well, in a famous essay on what's called the perpetual peace tradition, we're going to have to do a chalk satyagraha at some point. This is what we're reduced to. Oh, thank you. That's right. I forget. Okay. Aha. I was enjoying complaining about it. Anyway, yeah, perpetual peace is a term that we give to a tradition of thought which really lasted for hundreds of years and was an attempt to think of a way that the human species could live at peace. It wasn't a terribly effective tradition because in a couple of ways, it wasn't very realistic. It relied mainly on law and treaties. And, during the Cold War, it was calculated that the average lifespan of a treaty was 2.5 years, if you were lucky. It's just words on paper. You cannot legislate world peace. But I think intellectually, the best contribution ever made to this whole tradition was an essay by Immanuel Kant, which he wrote in 1795, but who's counting, called Zum ewigen Frieden, on perpetual peace. And well, I was going to say it really repays reading, but you'd have to have about 3 spring breaks to read it. I mean, Kant was very dense. German, English, nothing's going to help. It's very, very dense reading. But unfortunately, it's every now and then you come across something brilliant and you realize that you have to slog through all of this stuff to get to that nugget. So someday when you find yourself on the Galapagos Islands for 3 weeks and nothing else to do, bring a German dictionary and Zum ewigen Frieden with you and enjoy this thing. One of the points that he makes in that treatise is that nature has figured out a way of keeping us from waging war on one another. Very simple. She scattered us all over the globe. We can't wage war on one another because we can't reach each other. Well, of course, we now know that that was naive. Now you can press a button in Moscow and a silo will open up in some submarine in the mid-Atlantic or something, and there'll be no more I Heart New York going on anymore. So that was in a way naive, but it brings out an interesting point that it seems like the world process has provided isolation as a temporary measure, which if we use it properly, we could develop mechanisms robust enough that we could withstand exposure to other communities. Let me just a little clearer what I'm talking about because I can see that Sam is puzzled for this. Take a look at a community, one of the peaceable people studied in that anthropological sweep, brought in about 55 communities. They're called the Semoi. I think I mentioned them before. There's different ways of spelling that. And they live in the middle of the Malay Peninsula. And they are isolated. They were obviously driven up country when the Malays arrived, and so they live in rainforests, the top high altitudes, and they don't mingle much with the Malay. And they developed I'm going to call it a non-violent culture. In other words, it was a culture that enabled them to avoid violence, but it didn't give them a robust mechanism for dealing with violence when it occurred. These are the people who had this folk tale about, someone will sit around the fire at night and he'll say, I was walking through the jungle with my friend, and suddenly, what did we come across? A bunch of Malays. Those downcountry people, they're very uncivilized and violent, and so they started attacking us immediately. And I stood there and said to my friend, you run. And I said, take me, spare my friend. And Malays were so impressed that they left me alone. So it's a great nonviolent episode. The first anthropologist who collected the story was very excited. The second anthropologist who collected it 20 years later was beginning to get concerned. And by the fifth anthropologist, we realized that this was not a story that actually happened. It's part of their folklore. But that's okay for our purposes. We don't care what happened up there in the jungle. What we care about is that these people had a nonviolent culture in which they praised courage as a way of overcoming conflict. But then a form of early globalization known as the Cold War happened, and all of Southeast Asia was swept up into this brawl between the US and the USSR, disguised as an ideological conflict. You remember Galbraith saying, in capitalism, man exploits man, and in communism, it's exactly the other way around. So they're just jousting really for who's going to get to exploit the rest of the world. Anyway, the point here is that the Semoi got swept up into this conflict. And so you might think, they were dragged into it kicking and screaming, they dragged their feet, they didn't know how to handle weapons, they were very reluctant. But alas, what actually happened was they went ballistic. They just went completely over the top, cannibalism, everything. It was grotesque. And I guess the way to understand this is they had mechanisms for damping violence, but not for really coping with it, despite that story that I told you. And their unanimity and their harmony was predicated on common hatred of another. We all recognize this from Pax 164A. This is the old scapegoating business. And it works very well as long as Kant's principle obtains. And you don't encounter anybody else outside the community. It will, quote, work, unquote. But it will not, no quotes, work. It will not really make things better in a long-term and stable way. So this is what I'm calling this punctuated evolution, where you have peace mechanisms which last up to a certain level of integration, and then they don't withstand the shock of first contact with the developed world. And this is not only a phenomenon that happens to these indigenous communities, but the very perpetual peace tradition was at fault here because it was mostly what they turned out to mostly have in mind. This was the other great drawback of this tradition, was let's have Christians stop fighting Christians. In other words, let's all gang up on the Turks and we'll have peace. Well, we're still suffering from the fallout from all this stuff. Can they join the European Union? I'm not sure. Who are they? Should they? Arby might have something to say on that. Anyway, even in highly developed countries, there was another stage of the same process of punctuation, where you had an attempt to create a kind of peace regime, but it was predicated on the common expulsion of another. So it was not a stable regime that was going to really last. And so where are we now with all of this? Well, it looks like we're up to, as far as planet Earth is concerned, and that is the main planet that I'm going to be concerned with here today, it looks like we are up to the final crisis/opportunity. We have no way of isolating ourselves from one another anymore. You go into a cornfield and pick an ear of corn, and it turns out it's got a funny gene that was put in it in Mexico, and the wind brought it up to Nevada, and somebody accidentally took it on their shoes into California. And we, as I say, we have weapons that go everywhere. We have spy satellites that photograph every square yard of the Earth once a day or something like that. I don't remember, but fortunately we're safe in this ghastly classroom with no exposure to the outside world. It's probably not even true. But given all of this technology, and the communication technology in particular, and weapons technology in another sense, all barriers are rapidly breaking down. So if you want to look at this pessimistically, it looks like we don't have robust enough systems of conflict conversion that are going to help us get over this hump. But if you want to look at it optimistically, we're being forced to become one planet, whether we like it or not. It's either become one planet or go into the dustbin of cosmic history. And what we've been discovering in the last, what is it, about 10 or 15 years, that there's lots of other planets out there. If ours fails, God, whoever she is, probably has something else in mind for another one. However, we're responsible for this one. Okay, I'm not saying we should not take this very, very seriously, but I am saying that behind all of the manifold critical aspects of the global revolution that's happening there is an opportunity behind every one of them. So from the nonviolence point of view, conflict becomes the main problem. All the other problems are there, but they are secondary to the conflict problem integrated with it. And we want to try and look at this as an opportunity rather than a crisis for the most part. So I want to look at that crisis a little bit and think for just a bit about what globalism is. It's not something that I know a whole lot about, but I've done some thinking about it, read some books about it. We can all discuss it together. And I guess I would describe it as a process which is both broader and deeper than we've ever seen before. Broader in the sense that we've just been talking about, where I stayed with my niece last night, and she has a job where she travels a lot. And she was telling me, gee, I feel nervous. I'm walking around without a plane ticket in my wallet. I've never liked this. What's wrong? I better get on the internet and get myself some tickets, even though I'm not planning to go anywhere. That was tongue in cheek, but it does go to show you, what the world is like. When we were in high school, we had one fellow student who actually went to Europe before he graduated high school. Now about half of us go to high school in Europe. Anyway, unless we come from Europe, in which case we go to high school here. But anyway, of course, it's broader in that sense, and that's very obvious, and everybody knows this. And I have at least one friend, for example, in Holland. He's a brilliant entrepreneur, Eckhart Winsen, who ran the first software company in Holland and was forced out of it with only a couple $100 million to his name. He has a very funky office off in the woods somewhere in the center of Holland. And his great scheme is to have Holland continue to be the trade hub for the world that it has always been, but to have most of the trade be virtual. So you don't have to actually ship things there, which is very costly and uses up a lot of fuel. You can just do it mostly by internet trading. Okay, so but that part of it is fairly obvious, but it's also a deeper globalization in the sense that people are reaching more deeply into the resources of nature to manipulate them. And in a little while I'm going to read you some highlights from an article on genetic modification. Okay, now as the system advances, what we've seen so far are little pockets of successful resistance, mostly when communities are pushed from poverty into destitution, or there's a threat of that. So one of the iconic poster uprisings is Cochabamba. Is that what we're going to talk about, Amy? The Zapatista uprising? Yes, of course, that's very, yeah. Well, they haven't decided yet what they are. I think we're going to, after I've read a few of your papers, we'll weigh in on whether they're violent or non-violent. But I do know that Subcomandante Marcos sent a message up to a bunch of us a number of years ago when he had not laid down the gun yet, and he said, you show me a better way, I will take it. So he's not ideologically committed to violence. And what they actually did was they used violence. I'm not saying this is an okay thing to do, but they used it as a publicity stunt. They used it to shoot. Huh? They did use unarmed witnesses, and it has led to a whole kind of a funny take on violence. I know there's an email that went around a couple of years ago that said, air attack, EZLN, air attack on armed camp. And you went and read a few lines down, and it turns out what they did was they stood around this military base, and they folded up, they had propaganda leaflets, they folded them into paper airplanes and sent them over the fence into the camp. So, but the one I was going to actually talk about, I'm not going to talk about much, just mention it, was Cochabamba, where Bechtel decided to privatize the water. Resource that Homo sapiens had probably been using in Bolivia for 20,000 years, no problem. It rains every year, they drink the rains, going on just fine. But Bechtel said this is not a good situation, nobody's making profit. So they stepped in and privatized the water, and 2 weeks later, Bechtel was out of that country. They had no mandate to operate in that country anymore because of a popular uprising, which was not violent in the sense that nobody used arms or anything like that. Then I think the uprising became a downseating, whatever you want to say. It went right back down as soon as the issue was no longer there. But it leaves a bit of a residue, and as you know, you have a chain of very, very populist and for the most part anti-globalist heads of countries around Central and South America now. So to get a handle on this crisis, I'm going to recommend a couple of books, one very big and one very small. So you can take your pick, which one you want to read. The big one is called The Case Against the Global Economy and For a Turn Toward the Local. It's by Jerry Mander and Edward Goldsmith. Jerry Mander I owe him a lot because he actually gave me the title of my first nonviolence book. And it only cost me one latte in Point Ray's Station Cafe. So I'm really, really a good buddy with Jerry. So he's the person who wrote 4 arguments in favor of the elimination of television. He's one of these people who turned his advertising skills into good uses. He's mainly interested in Native American cultures. But there's another very small book, which is called The Very Small Book on Globalism. There actually is a series of books that I believe Cambridge University Press puts out called The Very Small Book on. It's not the same as X, Y, and Z for dummies. This is for smart people who don't have a lot of time. And as most smart people don't, because if you're smart, you know that things are in a very bad way and you better do something about it. But the one on globalism is by Manfred Steger. And it's a good way to get a quick overview of what this thing is. I'm going to get back to him in a second, but I want to talk about 2 other people, and this really almost introduces a new topic, which we're going to talk about as our last topic for the semester, namely a nonviolent culture. And I can't use the word paradigm for shift for this anymore because the term has been shifted to the other side. So let's use a term that's getting to be current, and that's the Great Turning. This is the idea of, and there's a book on that subject by David Korten. And he represents a very good blend of theory and praxis. He runs something called the Center for Positive Futures up on Bainbridge Island in Washington, and they publish Yes magazine. And he's written a series of books, and they're all good, but I think they've been getting better, as is not always the case. He wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World, and then another one called Post-Corporate World, and now The Great Turning, where he really is starting to introduce the concept of a spiritual awakening, a spiritual revolution, without which most of the stuff either will not happen or will not happen in a very enduring way. But I think he borrowed that term from a very popular